The Abbott government has revealed the ABC will face budget cuts of about $200 million over the next 4 years. The ABC says a cut of that magnitude will unavoidably affect programming, while the government insists that the money can be found in efficiencies. With me now in our Sydney studio is the Communications Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. Welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Leigh.
So how come we're here having a discussion about a 5% cut to the ABC when in the election campaign the government unequivocally said no cuts to the ABC?
Well, the Prime Minister said that in one interview, I think the night before the election. But Joe Hockey and I had made it very clear on a number of ABC programs, in fact, that if there were going to be cuts across the board, as plainly there would have to be, across the board of government, I mean, to address the budgetary problems, the budget deficit and so forth, then the ABC and SBS couldn't be exempt. But we would be seeking to address waste and inefficiencies and not, as some people were urging us to do, cut the ABC's budget with the intent of reducing its digital presence or its broadcasting activities.
Voters have misinterpreted and they shouldn't have taken no cuts as no cuts. They should have been passing Mr Abbott's comments and Mr Hockey's comments and your comments to try to figure out exactly what that meant.
Well, look, I've defended the Prime Minister on this today and earlier in the week. I think you've got to take his comments, which look, I mean, what he said, and it's there, it's on the record. But you've got to take that in the context. And I can only assume that what Mr Abbott was referring to, or was thinking about anyway, was the proposition that there would be cuts in with the intent of reducing ABC services, and we'd ruled that out.
I don't want to get bogged down because I want to get to the detail, but you must understand that for voters, when someone says no cuts, you think no cuts.
No, look, I understand that, but to accept that Tony Abbott meant the ABC and SBS out of all of the agencies of government would be exempt from any savings measure. To accept that, you would have to assume that he had decided on the eve of the election to overrule and contradict the very carefully considered statements that Joe Hockey and I had been making. Now, that's a big call too.
All right, let's drill down into some of the detail. You've made some recommendations about how the ABC should work. You want the board directly involved in editorial process, the appointment of the chief...
Well, that's not quite true. That's not what I've said.
We'll come back to that in a second, but let me just start broadly.
Okay.
The appointment of a chief financial officer. You want the managing director, Mark Scott, relieved of responsibilities as editor-in-chief. Doesn't prescribing those sort of changes amount to political interference?
No, not at all. The ABC's statute, its Act of Parliament in Section 8, provides for the minister to write to the ABC board and give the government's views on matters of policy and administration and so forth. And the board is obliged to consider it, but not obliged to follow it or comply with it. And I absolutely respect the proposition that the ABC is totally independent in terms of its editorial decisions and its programming. As I said today in Adelaide, Mr Putin's method of media management is no more worthy of emulation than his foreign policy.
So they can take or leave your advice, you're saying?
That's what the law says. But in terms of editorial matters, a lot of people write to me. They write to me all the time and say, why don't you tell Leigh Sales to do this? Why don't you tell Tony Jones to do that? And some people actually think the Minister for Communications is responsible for the editorial on the ABC. Well, the first thing is I'm not, and the second thing is I oughtn't to be.
Okay,
it's really important that we preserve the editorial independence of the ABC.
Well, let's pick up on that point and address this thing about the board that you think I incorrectly summarised. You've said that the board should be involved in ensuring objectivity and impartiality and accuracy of those reports and whatnot.
Yes, I have, and that's what the Act of Parliament that constitutes this corporation says.
The board is full of political appointees, so would you be happy for a Labor appointee to the board to ring a journalist and dictate, well, here's what I think an objective question constitutes?
I'm not sure that the board, that's not how boards operate, but what the Act of Parliament says, again in Section 8, is that the board is responsible for a number of things, but one of them is ensuring that the ABC's news and information is accurate and objective, accurate and impartial, I think the words are, in accordance with the objective standards of journalism.
So how would you want that to work in practice?
Well, I think what the board has got to do is obviously get involved, not in terms of telling you what to do on the air, but I think the board has to recognise that the buck in terms of the ABC's impartiality stops with it. Now getting to the point about Mark Scott, the Managing Director. Mark has the title of Managing Director and Editor-in-Chief. Now, I'm not quite sure what Editor-in-Chief actually means, but as you know, Mark does not run news and current affairs at the ABC, Kate Tawney does, but it creates the impression that he is in charge of news and current affairs here in a direct way, which he isn't. And so my own, and look, this is just
but if you make the head of news, say, editor-in-chief, then who is responsible for editorial breaches by non-news programs? So, for example, The Chaser or Catalyst, editor-in-chief covers the full range of ABC shows. It's not just a news network.
Well, I think that maybe there's an opportunity for some clarification there, but the term editor-in-chief is traditionally used in media companies, in newspaper companies in particular.
Okay.
And it does create the impression that Mark Scott is, running news and current affairs, which, as I said, he isn't, and B, he wouldn't have the time to do it anyway, even if he wanted to.
Okay.
So I do think that given of the the ABC's accuracy and impartiality and objectivity in its news and current affairs there is nothing it does that is more important than that, Leigh. And the board that has the responsibility for ensuring the corporation complies with the Act in being accurate and impartial. Now, my humble suggestion is, as a simple Minister of the Crown, is to say that the board should consider having the head of news and current affairs reporting directly to the CEO, obviously in the line of command, but also like the CFO to the board.
Because we want to get through some other things. The cuts over the 4 years break down into year 1, 20 million, year 2, 61 million, 3, 55 million, year 4, 68 million. Isn't it the case that the Lewis Efficiency Review says that $60 million a year is the ceiling of what the ABC can manage, and that even that will be tough to do?
I wouldn't agree with that. I think there are timing differences. I mean,
does the Lewis Review say that the ABC can afford to cut more than $60 million a year?
Well, there is plenty of scope for cuts, or savings at the ABC.
Is that what the Lewis Review says? And can you release the Lewis Review so people can read the full context of what it says about efficiencies at the ABC?
We haven't released it because it's been the subject of really a confidential, commercial, like an iterative process. I hate that word. But what I mean is it's been a collaborative process between the Department of Communications and the ABC and indeed SBS.
But the subject is pretty public now.
It is pretty public.
So why not put that information out there?
Well, I'm amazed it hasn't leaked. It just says
Feel free to give me a call anytime, Mr. Turnbull.
I don't do that. But look, there is plenty of scope for achieving these savings. I know the numbers look a bit lumpy, but that's because of timing differences. For example, there are very modest savings in the 2014-15 year, for example, and it does ramp up, and because some of these savings will take time to take effect. But there is plenty of scope there.
One question before we run out of time. Newspoll currently has the Coalition's primary vote at 36%. In a separate survey, Newspoll found that 84% of people approve of the job the ABC is doing. How much of a risk to the government is blowback from voters who support the ABC?
Well, look, making savings are never popularly. If you've got a budget, Labor left us with a budget that was massively in the red, heading towards $600 billion of debt. How do you address that? You've either got to raise revenue or cut spending, or a bit of both, and we've done a bit of both. The ABC and SBS can't be exempt, so we're seeking to do that. Yes, I'm sure people will be unhappy. People who will lose their jobs at the ABC will be particularly unhappy. But that is what is the alternative? Just running up more and more and more and more debt. You see, where there has been a great failure, I suppose, in the political discourse, is to hold Bill Shorten to account and say to him, all right, you don't like the government's savings measures. What is your alternative? And he doesn't have. He just sits back and doesn't offer any alternative. So presumably his alternative is just more and more debt.
We have run out of time, unfortunately. Mr. Turnbull, thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks so much, Leigh.